StarCraft has to be the science fiction franchise that has inspired me for the longest, and I always wished there was some kind of way to build things in the StarCraft universe. And now, just about 25 years later, my dreams finally came true. Because we got StarCraft, the miniature game.
Hell, it's about time.
There's something special about holding a box in my hands with this branding. All the amazing artwork takes me right back to holding the Wings of Liberty box, eager to install it and get to play. Archon Studios kindly sent me this early copy of the Founders Edition 2-player set, and they also decided to sponsor this video. Just between you and me, I would have done this for free, because I'm a massive StarCraft nerd. I still hear
you must construct additional pylons
in my sleep now and then. Of course, I had to open the box right away to check out everything. The box is so tightly packed, it won't even close properly. Adding anything else to this box is like trying to fit more than 12 units into a control group in Brood Wars. Physically impossible. We already have seen this from other board games that have two factions in one box. The Terran come in blue and the Zerg come in purple plastic. So when you want to play right away without painting them, you have an easier time. And if you look closely, you can also see these sprues that are cast in clear plastic. Let's be honest, what Archon Studios cooked up here is a stroke of genius. These are basically small special effects that you can use on your minis. Muzzle flashes and other weapon effects, a basing material, and stuff like clear wings for the Zerg. And I'll show you a few cool things that you can do with them later on. The box also comes with a pretty high quality gaming mat made from cloth, stat cards and other material you need to play. And of course, a construction manual. Archon Studios has massive experience with plastic sprues for gaming, and it really shows. Not only is everything labeled in an easy and understandable way, and most of the time I didn't even need the manual. The cleaning is also a breeze, mold lines are minimal, and the plastic is so forgiving too. Never phrase when you cut into it or when you run a knife along mold lines, and just brushing over them with plastic glue works surprisingly well. And by the way, I know a lot of people like the Tamiya extra thin cement, but this Mr. Cement S is the real MVP among plastic glues. As you know by now, assembling minis is not my favorite part of the miniature hobby, so this is something I pay attention to when working with a new game for the first time. And I gotta say, these kits are on the more complex side. This Roach was 18 parts, which is quite a lot, but nothing is overly complicated, and the parts fit really well too. So even when they go for something like spikes peeking through exoskeletons, and they have them separate to keep the gap between them, because let's face it, filled undercuts suck. It might look complicated, but everything just slides in place. Really good engineering in my book. And lots of gaps are covered up by other parts, and the clear plastic parts can be glued like any other plastic part too, which is good because that keeps things simple. Another great thing is that with most minis you get a lot of options, and you also get a fully modeled token for buried units too. From the circling sprue you can also build raptors or swarmlings, basically whether you want to be annoyingly fast or even more annoyingly fast. And most characters have different base options. Like Kerrigan here, you can either mount on some tentacles if you're into hentai, or just on a sloped rock. I assembled some of my favorite units to get a feeling for the process, but also because I constantly flip-flop between what I wanted to paint first. And this really felt like being a kid in a toy store that wants to play with every single one of them. Ultimately though, I showed some restraint and ended up with an assembled Marine and a Marauder on the Terran side, and a Roach, one Raptor, and Kerrigan, the Queen of Blades herself, on the Zerg side. These would act as prototypes for my armies, and I'd just try and experiment as much as possible to find my color schemes and special effects that I could later replicate as my army grows. And I gotta say, the quality of these minis is among the best the industry has to offer right now. Sharp edges, crisp casting, there's no undercuts whatsoever, and the material has a premium feel to it. One slight drawback is, of course, as always, the monopose assembly. But all of these minis come with so many different assembly options that it's not really a big deal, at least in my opinion. My first instinct was to paint the Marine right away, because they are just so iconic. I mean, if you don't hear "go go go" while looking at this guy, then I don't know what's wrong with you. But I knew I had some experimenting to do to crack the perfect color scheme of my Marauders. You see, in the game and most artworks, they're black, and I knew right away I wanted to make them dark, but definitely not pure black with gray edge highlights. that's a bit played out in my opinion. My intuition was to paint these up more like a walking tank and maybe use a few scale modeling techniques in the process to make the armor look like it has seen a lot of battle and has the scars to show for it. That's why I wanted my base layer to already have a lot of discolorations. The idea was that there's layers over layers of battle damage and burn marks and maybe a little bit of corrosion too. So I started from a brownish layer, and you can see it took a while to dial it in, but once I added a lot more scrag brown, I had a result that I liked. So now over this dark brown layer, I applied a generous layer of chipping fluid and then applied a layer of German field gray. This is a very nice dark and bluish gray that would work really well with the red brown below. This layer shouldn't be too bright because it's still part of my base layer, as you'll see in a minute. Then using a brush with stiffer bristles and some warm water, I started rubbing off the field gray, and you can see that this makes the paint flake off. It's not really a super controlled technique usually, but here the paint mostly did what I wanted, and if it didn't, well, you know, happy little accidents usually happen for a reason. You see that sometimes I'm stippling, sometimes I'm dragging or pushing the brush, basically microing, just not with a mouse and a keyboard, but with a stick that has bristles on it. It usually takes a little bit of practice to get a pattern you like. And in this shot you can see that I switched to a brush with even stiffer bristles. As it turned out, a little more force was needed to get the paint to flake off completely. But you finally should be getting an idea about what my goal was here. On the leg, I had a major area of the gray chip off, which made me really happy because that's exactly what I had in mind. A gray base color with large patches of brown discoloration, but corrosion and heat caking the paint into the material, resulting in lots and lots of inconsistencies. And even though I also wanted to keep some areas mostly undisturbed, I still continued to treat most edges like this, simply because a dark edge frames the elements nicely and, well, also looks like a natural way of how these features would get worn out over time. Then I loaded light field gray into my airbrush and started applying a senator layer of paint. I'll deliberately try to define all these shapes a little, focusing the highlights on parts facing up and keeping a little bit of shading, as you can see on the lower parts of the shoulder guards. This creates volume, and this is what makes a model look less like a model and more like a huge chunker like he's supposed to be. Obviously, I'm putting less highlights on parts that are lower on the model, and then once I was happy with the light sketch, I took a sturdy brush again and started to bring out the chipping again that I covered up. Sometimes this would overlap with the chipping I did on the first layer, and sometimes I would chip in a different place. But this is exactly what I meant when initially I said I want this to be a multiple layers of weathering and wear. Now the airbrush doesn't really care about recesses. When you blast the surface, it usually makes everything bright, which means the deepest parts of this mini would need some shading. So I covered the whole mini in gloss varnish and mixed black oil paint with white spirit to create the recess wash. And as usual, I would just lightly dab on the loaded brush to the mini and let the paint flow into the recesses, letting capillary effects do their thing. I wiped off any spill that was left with a makeup sponge and applied a layer of matte varnish. We don't really want this guy to be a shiny boy. Then it was time to add the next layer of weathering. I used pale gray blue and sponged on the paint carefully. I deliberately tried to hit areas that did not have a lot of definition yet. So the top of the shoulders and that apex of the rounded features in the back, the top of the head, and so on. Not only does this add a little more complexity and interest, it adds a lighter layer of paint, which in turn pushes the contrast of the mini. The box Archon Studios sent to me is the 2-player starter set Founders Edition, which comes discounted during the pre-order phase and contains everything you need to get started to play a game of StarCraft. It's jam-packed to the brim with 33 Zerg and 19 Terran minis, and also includes a playmat, dice, tokens, stat cards, terrain, and all the assembly manuals you'll need. There's also a separate Founders Edition starter set for Protoss available at a discounted price. You can still get the Founders Edition box during the pre-order phase, which is running until the 17th of April. And after that, there'll be a separate starter set for each of the 3 factions. You can still pick up the Zeratool promo miniature that comes in 2 variants, one of them cast completely in see-through plastic. You can pre-order everything else from Wave 1 too. You bet that I already ordered a copy of my favorite StarCraft unit ever, the Hydralisks. And don't miss out on the early bird discounts and pre-order now using the link in the description. I liked the result a lot so far, but he was still rather grey and uniform, so I started to cover up areas I wanted to remain grey with masking putty and started layering on deep turquoise ink. This gave a rather smooth result, but honestly, all that masking was a little tedious and time intensive, so I just tried applying the ink with a brush. And what do you know? Can't really see a difference. I think the turquoise fits the muted appearance a bit more than straight up primary blue, and I guess it harmonizes a bit better with the field gray, as that also has a little green in it. I slapped on a little bright turquoise on the edges, especially these heat dispenser holes looked a little boring without them, and I also pushed the brightness on some edges on higher up areas. Additionally, the chipping got dulled down a little by the ink, so I straight up just stabbed the brush on in an erratic way to create more of them. And while I liked the result, I still wanted the shadows to be a little darker, so I loaded my airbrush with black contrast paint and basically gave the whole mini an anti-senator shading. But I'm also turning the mini around. Any area that I find too bright, I just tone down, like the space behind the arm and the lower part of the fuel tanks back here. This adds additional weight to the mini. It makes it look like these structures are big enough to cast a dark shadow, or big enough to where the size actually has a darker side, where the light source can't reach properly. I did add a subtle highlight on these inverted edges in the front with the chipping color, and also applied some edge highlights, and mostly to those facing up that are very visible. This of course defines and divides the major shapes a bit more. I'm mostly dabbing on the brush instead of painting lines, so these highlights look irregular and random. I put a few oil paints down, mainly different brown tones and black, but also a desaturated green, and I placed small dots on the surface of the mini randomly. But some of them also very deliberately, like on places where the armor was dented, like on edges, or some more visible darker chips, because that's where water would collect. Then using a flat brush, moist with a little white spirit, I drag them out using these broad strokes. I usually try to do this flicking my whole wrist so the resulting lines are straight. Here it just ended up a little too white, but that's okay because at this stage everything can be wiped away still. I just had to switch to a more controlled setup where I place my hands together and just make a dragging motion with the fingers holding the brush, which gave me a bit more control. You really gotta find your groove with this technique, and everyone does it slightly different. The streaking of course simulates rust or liquids running down, but sometimes this can also be used on areas that get hit by exhaust fumes a lot. In more confined spaces I usually switch to a smaller brush, and once everything was finished and the streaking was cured, I hit it all with one last layer of matte varnish. I wanted to do something special with the exhaust fumes on the rocket launcher. You can of course leave the see-through plastic and it will look good, but I base coated it black so I could paint the fire and smoke effect. I gave it all a layer of white paint so all the recesses were covered, and then to speed things up I hit it with the airbrush until I had a solid layer. I'm also hitting the surrounding areas with a few thin layers so I can mimic a glowing pattern. To make sure I don't have any overspray, I'm covering most of what could get in the way with masking putty and then hit the reflections, especially with a mix of red speed paint and fluorescent orange. I wanted this area darker since it would be further away from the light source. Then I switched to pure fluorescent orange and hit the plume with it until it was fully covered. I took light orange fluo enamel paint and let that run into the recesses. This is like an oil wash and will stay in the recesses mostly and spread through capillary effects. And once dry, it's also super opaque and intense. For these brightest spots, I placed yellow fluo enamel paint in more confined areas and then let everything dry. Next I'm hitting this with slaughter red speed paint from the front, darkening the areas further away from the source. And then I'm switching to black with a little gray mixed in and start building the base for the smoke part of the plume. I mixed in more and more white to make the gray brighter and covered less in this area until I hit it with a last carefully placed speck of white. I brought back some pure white between the expanding fire and the muzzle with oil paint, and then I painted a small rocket black and added a few gray highlights. On some areas close to the explosion, I highlighted the edges with white, as these would catch more light than the rest, and also the metal parts like the magazine reflects light stronger because, well, it's a more reflective surface. I then covered this in fluid paint again, orange for less intense reflections and yellow for the closer parts. I wanted the bases to be intense red and dusty, like a red desert or wasteland. So I created a base layer with this AK interactive structure paste, spreading it all over the base and keeping some inconsistencies where they would naturally occur. So the pigment I would use for the next phase could collect there. I also added a few larger pebbles to increase that effect. Once that was dry, I dry brushed the raised areas with red, and that was my Marauder prototype done. I really like how the multi-layered armor style came out. I think it turned into the perfect hybrid between miniature and scale model, and I think that's exactly what I want for the rest of my Terrans. Each of these factions has such a unique style. The Zerg are more organic, obviously, and the Protoss should have that advanced technology look to them, with more sleek and fluid designs. So my Terrans should be gritty guys, armors with hard edges and banged up equipment to look distinct. Now, I do want to paint the Terran Marine next, the iconic armor that these convicts are sealed into and then unleashed on humanity's opponents, but I still want to figure out how to adapt the style to these smaller shapes. Blizzard really created some iconic designs for StarCraft, and their awesome animations were the gold standard for a long time. Always really inspiring. To find my Zerg scheme, I worked on a Roach, which is this bulkier, armored brawler, and Kerrigan, who is this more delicate and slender mini by contrast. To keep the clear plastic, I covered it in masking putty while priming and then built the main colors with the airbrush. On the Roach that meant magenta on the softer parts of the body, mixing it from purple and a dark pink to hit a shade I like, and a beige bone color for the armored parts. I decided to do the lighter color last because if I had some of the beige bleeding into the magenta, I could just use that as a first highlight later on. And at the same time, any magenta left on the edges of the armor would just act as an additional color shift that makes the gradients more interesting. On the abdominal part where we have these insect-like plates, I also built brighter highlights with the beige through the airbrush and kept some pink lines along the center features. This was obviously a different material and I wanted it to show. Kerrigan is part human, so I chose my colors a bit more carefully, basically working off of a skin tone for the bulk of her body, and I did some pre-shading like on the Roach, but I made sure to pay a bit more attention to it here. As you can see, I built a more volumetric base layer, keeping some of the black in the recesses between muscle groups and features of the skin. I deliberately also hit the areas where the more human form transitions into the Zerg elements, like where the wings attach and the exoskeletons on the legs and arms. The goal was to have most color transitions and color shifts in place before the shading, so I base coated her face slightly green, which obviously is a callback to Brood Wars more than anything. Also sneaking in some transitions from green to skin tones around the neck and shoulders, and the hands and legs are left completely black. I base coated the wings in a more greenish yellow color because I knew I didn't want to shade these as much as most other parts of the Roach. And I was leaving the tips black because I had something special planned for these parts. And then I moved on to the next step. To shade the hard parts on the Roach, I went with hardened leather speed paint, defining all the recesses and at the same time staining all raised areas. The result was a little too bright first, and I needed a second layer. Here I did add a little dark brown regular acrylic paint to the speed paint to make sure there was a little more coverage. For the rest of the body I used a similar approach, shading it all with purple alchemy speed paint, and you can see how that makes the skin a lot more defined, but also a lot more saturated and interesting. On Kerrigan I had to be a little more deliberate with this method. The wings were not the hardest part, I could simply use hardened leather again, and this time one layer would be enough since I wanted these to be more of a bone color. I also gave the bony parts on her chest and legs a layer of this, as well as the face to give it more depth, and then moved on to the purple alchemy for the rest of the body. Since my base layer is a lot brighter, the speed paint retains its magenta color a lot better on the midtones and especially the highlights, while it results more in a purple shade in the areas with the black still shining through. I think this looks really close to how she looks in original artworks and the animations, and I like that a lot. As you can see, I make sure to not cover too much of the highlight parts, and I will also add a second layer in some areas that I want more chromatic. After all the speed paint slap shop, I had to tone down the shine again, so I could better plan my highlights, and after a coat of ultramatte varnish, I could also see the results better, how each segment would look and how the colors interacted, and that made planning the highlights a lot easier too. The color options I had for the highlights were a desaturated olive and ochre. Ultimately, I put both on the palette and mixed and matched a little, depending where on the mini I applied them. All of this armored body was now really uniform, so I decided to take the head a bit brighter, which would put some more focus on it. So I added a layer of light mod and then proceeded to highlight the major features like these big edges. And also built a few volumetric lights, as you can see on these spherical shapes on the legs. I went a bit brighter, putting some specular highlights on raised areas, but also gave the tip of the claws this line pattern. Not only are these areas a little empty, it also adds a bit more thought to the biology of these bugs. Obviously, these are some stabbing weapons, so they would need some kind of structural reinforcement where the force would be applied. I highlighted the rest of the body with a first layer of pink and then built specular highlights with basic skin tone. And what I do here was to highlight the major features, but then add lines, kind of like strings of connective tissue between these bigger and more defined features. The goal was to give this part a more sinewy appearance, and well, it was fun to do a little freehand painting and add some personal flavor. So on the spikes and the little stubby claws on the rest of the limbs, I just went ahead and using a brighter beige reinforced the patterns my initial airbrush sketch built. On the spikes you can see that the backside retained a lot more purple than the front, which looked kinda cool, so I rolled with it. And on the legs I had some very dark recesses still showing, so I also leaned into that and put brighter highlights next to them. Using whites I gave this a few more highlights, building up the line structures even more and painting a scratch and a dot here and there for some extra structure. Now these ended up looking a little sterile, so I added a few glazes of sienna and umber ink, the sienna mostly to stain the surfaces and the umber to darken certain recesses even more. On the claws I glazed these layers more towards the tips, and on the spikes I focused them more on the bases. And because these features would obviously be used for some violence, I also dabbed on the side of my brush a couple of times to paint some chips and dents, just adding additional structure as usual. The last part that needed some work was the abdomen, and to distinguish it from the rest I went for a different highlight color. The initial airbrushing left this with a more purple shade, and I went ahead and highlighted the already bright spots with skin tones to lean into the color difference. I built some very sharp and bright lights to give the idea that this material is more shiny, typical to how insect exoskeletons also are very reflective, almost waxy in appearance. And then after highlighting the dark spikes coming from it, I used the red ink to define the recesses even more. For Kerrigan, I tried not to overdo the highlight on the body. I mainly mixed the contrast paint with basic skin tone for a first highlight and then used pure basic skin tone for specular highlights. And that was it. I spent a bit more time refining the face, using a lighter shade of light drab, and eventually a dab of white. I shaded the eye sockets with purple to make her look a little more dramatic, especially since the purple extended a bit outwards and the cheeks retained the same purple shade, just putting in a bit of a green outline around the jaw. I went on to defining a few elements that were not highlighted yet, like the black hands and the other cheeks, and some of the outer bone structures too. And then all that was left to do was the special effects. Whenever I'm using the clear bits, I am always going to add at least a darker layer of ink or contrast type paints to build some depth. And after this step was done, I built some additional detail. I wanted some buildup of saliva and acid around the mouth, so I took some uhu glue and a toothpick to build these thin threads. And something I find cool is that you can even spread this out to where it becomes a surface more than a thread, which wasn't my original intention here, but I still kept it. This was a good excuse to try a few products I have, but never used before, like this disgusting slime effect by the army painter. I mean, where else to use it than here? And I straight up just dumped it on the saliva threads. I also created some splattering around the mouth and on the mandibles. This paint has a gooey consistency, which makes it behave in a really cool way. Think really high viscosity, so dabbing it on with a brush would create really cool patterns. The idea was to create some foam buildup on top of the acid as it gets spit out. You know, just another layer of detail. The problem is that this dried almost invisible, except for the threads, which it stained nicely. So this gave me a good idea on how to make my foam effect more visible. So I simply added some white to the slime color. This would retain the viscosity and the randomness when dabbing on the paint, but leave a bright base that I could later stain with a pure layer of slime. And I like the result, but it was a bit more effort than I anticipated, and I don't think I will use this product again for this. You can probably get a very similar effect with fluorescent green and yellow. I built the same base I used on the Marauder because I do plan to have 2 playable forces at home, so I can just lend one of them to a friend for a quick game. And in my opinion, having 2 armies on the same bases and making it look like they are on the same battlefield is a nice little detail when they are fighting against each other. The abdomen has these pimples on the surface, and I ignored them for a very long time, but they kept staring at me like, ain't you gonna paint us? Huh? So I did dab a bit of red contrast paint on, trying to create blobs, but my brush didn't really leave round patterns like I wanted to. So I went into full panic mode and tried to fix it by dabbing on more and smaller dots in between, and that just made everything worse. And as the drama kept unfolding, eventually I just decided to tone the whole section down by airbrushing on a dark color. So I used Occultist Cloak Speed Paint, which is a purple-black. And funny enough, I think not only does this tone down the ugly pattern, it also adds some much needed shading to the lower side of the abdomen. Happy little accidents. To tie everything together, I kept this color in the airbrush and added some purple alchemy, the magenta speed paint from earlier, up to a point where it was about a 50-50 mix. And then added a bit of color shift to some areas of the carapax and the armor on the legs. And then I came in with a final layer of ultimate varnish. I also wanted the eyes to stand out, so I painted the eyeballs white and built up thin layers of red and orange around it to set up a little glow effect. And then tinted the eyes with yellow fluo and the last layer of orange fluo to tie it all together. On Kerrigan, I did a very similar thing, painting the eyeballs white, but adding a dark outline around them to make her gaze a little more intense before repeating the same steps. I dumped some white oil paint into the recesses around the black tips of the wings, mainly the small dimples and also the connective part of the last segment, and after cleaning it up, sprayed this area with fluorescent purple for a little glow effect. And to round it all out, I tried putting pink fluo into more confined areas, which has been made a bit easier by the fact I could just wipe away most of this enamel paint after it was dry again. The base was sculpted on this figure and I didn't have any room to add my red structure paste, so I first focused on tying the mini and the base together by applying purple to the recesses and anything facing down, and then sprayed on a mix of green and ochre from the top, followed by some edge highlights with medium sea gray. To tie it in with my other bases, I used light rust dust, applying it to the base and letting it soak up into the recesses. So here we are, 28 years after I got infested with the StarCraft virus, basically patient zero of poor life decisions and excellent gaming memories. We finally have an official StarCraft Miniatures game. And it's not just quickly cobbled together. The miniatures are actually super high quality, and that makes it an even better experience to assemble these and paint them up the way I always envisioned them. Any of these factions will look so good as an army, but I'm also looking forward to use these minis in dioramas or other showcase pieces. I already have such a great idea for my Rainer and the Zerg Queen, a totally peaceful meeting that will definitely not end in infestation or emotional trauma. These minis will definitely be on my painting table a lot moving forward. You know me, I'm not just saying that because Archon Studios sponsored this video, but because it's true. I'm just so happy that I finally have another franchise of miniatures that I'm really invested in and that will be with me through my painting hobby for years to come. Let me know if you're interested in more StarCraft miniature painting videos, and if there is enough appetite for it, I'll be happy to oblige. For now, thanks for watching, keep pushing that pigment, and see you in the next one.